HRV, while a good metric for looking at nervous system functioning and adaptability, it is not a metric that can only be looked at a single snapshot. It has to be looked at longitudinally.
Hello and welcome to the Move the Change podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Munsey. I'm glad you're here with us today for this episode of the Move the Change podcast. Look, as an entrepreneur, best-selling author, and keynote speaker, I help executives and leaders take the next steps towards success. Everybody needs a big goal, but unless you break it down and attack it one step at a time, you're likely to get overwhelmed, fall short, and even give up. And this is exactly what I help folks overcome. Every week on the show, I'll give you the best tools and tips to achieve your big dreams by breaking them down into actionable, easy steps that you can take every day, every week to achieve your big goals. We're also going to interview some of the world's most successful people and learn how they've managed to push through and achieve their dreams. Like, a big part of being a high performer is understanding your nervous system. I'm really excited for you today. Today's guest, Dr. Jay Wiles. Dr. Jay is an internationally recognized speaker. He's a scientist, clinician, leading authority on stress physiology, human performance, and human optimization. We've got a ton of things in common. We've been looking forward to this conversation a lot. As a clinical health and performance psychologist, Dr. Jay specializes in heart rate variability. If you've read Fuck Your Feelings, you know this is a big topic. So we're going to talk about that. We'll talk about biofeedback, psychophysiology, nervous system resilience, helping individuals master their mental and physiological states to achieve peak performance. Dr. Jay is board certified in HRV and peripheral biofeedback, serves as a trusted consultant to elite athletes, executives, military personnel, and high performers. His expertise in leveraging biofeedback, behavioral interventions, and psychophysiological strategies has made him a sought-after resource for those looking to enhance focus, stress resilience, recovery, and overall performance. Dr. Jay, I probably should shorten that so we actually have time to talk. Thanks for being here, man. I'm really excited for this one.
Yeah, man, excited to chat with you. And it's great just to reach out. We were talking before this about the connections that we already had, the geographical, connections, but also like we kind of run in a lot of the same circles, have a lot of the same interests. So excited to see where this goes.
Me too. And so I think we talked a little bit about this, and just for people listening, look, HRV is such a huge topic. I don't want to do it a disservice. So we're going to spend a lot of time covering this. And if we don't get to everything, or we're just already going to say, we'll have you back on the show. We'll cover biofeedback, general sports psychology. And I want to get into the weeds of some of the work that you do with professional athletes. I know recently you were out with an NHL team during the playoffs. So there's a lot of stuff we can dive into there on sort of the tactics. But I think we really need to start. I think you and I both need scientists. We want to start with kind of the governing dynamics behind everything. And then we can get into use case. So we'll kind of take this maybe like intro level. We'll build on that. And then at the end of this thing today, we'll really nerd out on some really cool concepts. So I think let's maybe start then with just general. How would you teach somebody what HRV is and why it's important?
Yeah, it's a great fundamental question because HRV has become like ubiquitous, like it's everywhere, right? It doesn't matter what wearable that you pick up now, it's going to have some HRV metric. So most people are familiar with like Apple Watch and Whoop and Garmin and Oura Ring, and everyone has access to that data point now. And I think that while it's accessible and there's a ton of utility, I think understanding how to use it and when to use it is kind of like point number one, because there are so many misuses and misconceptions. And I see this like flaunted all over the place. Like someone will send me something on Instagram where it's like somebody's posted their Oura score and their HRV number, and they're like using it almost like a vanity metric. Like, look at me. And I'm like, if only it was that simple. Like it's nuanced, just like basically any biometric out there. It's more nuanced than that. So I think helping people to understand what the metric is is actually and what it's telling us. And then also maybe equally as important, if not more important, what it's not telling us is a good place to start. So I like to always anchor it to what people already know, which is heart rate. So people intuitively understand what heart rate is. And I think that most people would understand that like a good proxy for like recovery, and then maybe even looking at general wellness is where your resting heart rate is. And typically like the lower, the better. So there's no cutoffs for heart rate as to like, hey, you need to be at said heart rate, during the day or at rest. There's cutoff for heart rates, in terms of like zones for training, but that's kind of a different utility of a metric. So we'll just use heart rate in general. And we'll kind of just use kind of like a basic example and some very basic math that everybody can understand. So when you're like, let's say looking at your Apple Watch or you're looking at your Whoop and it's showing you your heart rate, it's typically showing your heart rate, and then it will say BPM, so beats per minute. So it'll say, we'll use 60, which is 60 beats per minute. Now that's an average. And the reason it's an average is because heart rate is dynamically changing every single second. Your heart rate is going up, it's going down, it's moving left, it's moving right. And so really it's just looking at over a window of 60 seconds, what is the average within that window? So 60 is very easy. So we say that if someone's heart rate is at 60 beats per minute, we know that on average, the heart is beating once every single second. 60 beats per minute, 60 seconds, 1 second is kind of the duration and time between heartbeats. Now, that would seem kind of like from a very basic understanding of heart rate, kind of how things work. Okay, so someone's 60 beats per minute, it's beating once every second. When in turn, that's actually not what's happening. And that goes back to what I was mentioning just a minute ago, right? Your heart rate's shifting dynamically. So it's going from 60 up to 70, 75, back down to 60, and then below 55, 50, 45, maybe even. So there's a wide range. So we're just looking at averages there. So by that kind of just sheer logic, that would mean that between successive heartbeats, let's say at 60 beats per minute, it's actually not 1 second. Like that's actually like the heart operating like a metronome. And a key feature about our physiology, especially cardiovascular physiology, is that the heart should not operate like a metronome. If the heart is operating like a metronome and it is beating very consistently, that person likely has a pacemaker in. So they know that they have cardiac problems. But for the quote unquote normal individual, you want to see that variance, which brings in heart rate variability. So by design, heart rate variability is looking at the variation that is occurring between successive beats of your heart rate. So again, if the heart rate is not operating like a metronome, that means that there's dynamic shifts. So again, when we think about someone's heart rate, let's say going from 60 up to like 70 to 75, there's actually a shortening in the duration of heart rates that's occurring, because as someone's heartbeat goes faster, you're not going to have as much time in between successive heartbeats. But then as it falls, that variability starts to widen, or the amount of time starts to widen. So the differences that are happening between successive heartbeats is what heart rate variability is. So I always kind of like put those two, not necessarily in opposition, because they do operate in tandem with one another, but they're very different. So a good kind of takeaway point here is that heart rate and heart rate variability are not the same. They're very much interconnected, but they're not the same. So if we have kind of an operational definition that heart rate variability is just the change or the variability that's occurring between successive heartbeats, then the kind of the next question is like, well, why is that even important? Like, what information is that giving us? Because I always tell people that there's so many data points we can get from our physiology, but if there's no kind of operational definition or understanding of how we utilize it, then who gives a shit about the data, right? It's just data. It's just numbers. So then I always kind of like to open up and unpack kind of the idea of what is that information telling us? Because any data that comes from the body should be able to provide us some insight into what is occurring in our physiology. So then I would kind of like almost provide even a more broader definition for heart rate variability. And the one that I always typically give is that HRV is the single greatest non-invasive proxy that we have for looking at how adaptive our nervous system is. And that's because we know that the changes that are occurring between all those heartbeats, so all that variability that's occurring, that's all coming from the autonomic nervous system. So the only way that we have change in kind of that variability is because of the autonomic nervous system. And if we want to give you more specific, and we'll unpack this a little bit later, all of that is being mediated by not one nerve. It's really kind of multiple nerves, but one branch of nerves that's primary for that is your 10th cranial nerve, which is your vagus nerve. And so there's a lot to unpack there, but I'll keep things a little bit more kind of like 30,000 foot view. So with heart rate variability, if we're thinking about, again, okay, so that's a proxy for the nervous system. We know that it's different from heart rate. Like, what does that metric actually like give us? Like what is that? How do we use that metric to help determine nervous system adaptability if it is indeed the proxy for that? And that really is not measured in a single dose. And I think this is, Ryan, this is probably the biggest myth that I get from most people. And I probably get like 25, 30, maybe sometimes 50 emails a month about somebody asking me about their quote unquote bad HRV. And there's so much again to unpack there. But the biggest myth that I think most people have is that they can take a snapshot of their physiology, looking at their nervous system. And therefore that kind of tells them again how adapted their nervous system is. One singular HRV score is never going to give you enough information because there's no context to it. We're not comparing it to anything else. And so I think that, and it's because it operates very different than other metrics, right? Like if I were to put a blood cuff on you right now, like a blood pressure cuff on you, and we took your blood pressure, like again, one singular metric is not going to tell us everything we need to know, but it will tell us something that is interpretable, right? Because we have those norm-based metrics. So if I say, okay, Ryan, like right now, like your blood pressure is 150 over 100, like, okay, we got some problems. This is like well into the hypertensive zone. We can't do that with HRV. Like I can't take one reading of your nervous system or my nervous system and say, yep, I can tell this person is adaptable. Like this person knows, like their nervous system knows how to be resilient. Like that's not the case. This is why we need more longitudinal data. This is like when you look at the wearables, or if you're like, say, for instance, if like you're ever working with me, like we're not just going to take one snapshot of your data. Like to start, I want to look at least a minimum of 2 weeks. And the reason for that is because HRV is a very dynamic metric, and we need to understand, again, the context behind it. That's the only way that we can have really, truly useful information because it changes like so quickly. Like I could literally check your heart rate variability right now, and then 30 seconds from now, it could look completely different. Why? Well, maybe someone just came into the room or is at your door and they're banging down saying that, hey, I'm about to come in and invade your home. If that's the case, heart rate's going to shoot up and your HRV is going to drop like a rock. But 30 seconds, before that, you may have been in a deep state of meditation and your heart rate's down in the 40s and your HRV is over 100. And so again, like those singular snapshots they're not helpful. They're not useful. And a lot of the ways, honestly, that like a lot of the consumer-based wearables are using HRV, they don't provide any context either. So therefore, it doesn't typically become that useful. So I would say, like, again, a good takeaway point from here is that like HRV, while a good metric for looking at nervous system functioning and adaptability, it is not a metric that can only be looked at a single snapshot. It has to be looked at longitudinally.
There's a lot of really awesome stuff in there. So I think I told my Instagram followers that we were going to do this, and I got a couple of questions, and there's two that I think are relevant to what you've discussed here so far. And so I'm going to try to sneak these in. One is, if we're looking at HRV as a biomarker to indicate this adaptability of the nervous system, can it be, or how can it be used as a tool to develop that same resilience or increase?
Yeah, there's a lot of practical. I actually think where heart rate variability shines is in kind of like two ways. Number one is a mechanism at looking at overall like systemic recovery. And then the second would be using it as an in the moment training tool. So a way not to improve HRV as a metric, because I just don't find a lot of use in that. Like, again, so many people are like, how can I improve my HRV? And I would kind of, as a scientist, like that lends the question of like, should you be trying to improve your HRV? And if so, what for? And I think that you could build a potential use case as to why you would want to improve your heart rate variability. But I think that that's a lot harder to do than I guess what people could even imagine. And I'd say that using it as a tool more as a way to track nervous system resiliency and train nervous system resiliency is where you're going to get your biggest return on investment. Because I think that chasing a number as the finish line won't yield you much value or much results. And more than anything, it probably would be a bit disheartening if, say, like someone comes to me and they're like, my HRV is like 15 milliseconds. Number one, they're almost always going to ask me like, am I going to die of like heart failure? And I'm like, oh my God, no, you're going to be okay. But the second would be is like, I think that I need to understand kind of your goal. And most people's goal is that like, especially if you think from like a mental performance or a sports performance perspective, they're like, my goal is to be more resilient to stress. My goal is to lock in. My goal is to like attain flow so that I can get like in the zone for my sport of choice. My goal is to recover faster for my sport or for mental performance, like as an executive or, as a special operator in the military. So a lot of it just depends on kind of like what the goal is, which is kind of how like we utilize it. But for the most part, we utilize it in very similar ways. So I'd say like, again, to kind of answer your question in terms of like how we can use it like as a tool to help build resiliency, it's tracking it over time and watching the trends, correlating those trends with behavior. Because at the end of the day, like we are humans, that humans are defined by their behavior. So by behavior and cognition or the ways that we define kind of like what we are as humans, predominantly cognition. That's kind of like sets us apart from our ability to plan and executive functioning sets us apart from like other animals. But I also say it's like we can correlate that with behavioral habits. And so if I'm seeing someone who has immensely poor nutrition, awful sleep, like they're not doing great in terms of like their overall exercise routine, their relationships are dog shit, like their, recovery tools are dog shit, they're using exogenous substances, all of these things can start to correlate over time with their nervous system repair and can provide us insight. But insight without action is useless, right? Again, data without any action is useless. So I'm always about like, well, what do we do in order to leverage behavior change from nervous system data? And then always kind of close the loop. So we can think about this as like a feedback loop system, right? So it's like we can check and see where we are, look at the behaviors that are occurring that could be correlated with nervous system functioning, engage in behavior change, engage in cognitive and mental change, and then come back and close the loop and say, well, did changing in that behavior then become reflective in changes in the nervous system? And that's where I think you can use it as a tool, almost kind of like it's kind of like a check-in tool for your nervous system, if you will. And then the other case, which is a little bit more nuanced and unpacked, is like, how can you use HRV as a tool in real time? And that's where we start to kind of unpack, more things like biofeedback and self-regulation and training kind of the nervous system to become more reflexive and adaptive. But I think if anybody wanted to start in one singular place, especially if they already are tracking heart rate variability via like a consumer-based wearable, it's like watching it longitudinally over time, correlating it with behaviors, making behavior change, and then rechecking again. So basically just continuing to recorrelate. Now that's a lot easier said than done because we're talking about the word, the concept of behavior change, which for many people, it's a sticky thing. It's really hard. Behavior change is difficult, if not impossible at times, or I should say feels impossible, because we know behavior change is 100% possible. But I think it's a matter of like the actually changing behavior to then recheck. That's the biggest hump for most people.
Yeah, I love that breakdown. The other question I wanted to throw in here was, do you have a favorite device or tool for measuring HRV?
Ooh, this is one of my favorite ones because there's so much out there. There's a lot of junk, and there is a lot of new technology, I would say, that's really starting to hit the nail on the head. Now, I will throw out a little bit of a disclaimer. One of the tools I'm about to mention, I do have a significant relationship with. So I want to be very clear about that. I'll mention that again when I talk about the tool. I just don't want there to be any the conflict of interest of me touting different types of technology, knowing that I have, financial interest in these. But I will talk about the ones that I do not have any financial interest or, fiduciary responsibilities to. So when we look at overnight HRV checking. So this is more of like using consumer-based wearables, really the only way to do it overnight. I am a huge fan of the Oura Ring. I think Oura Ring does it really well. Now, what I really like about Oura is that they're looking at it over the course of the night. So they're looking at HRV and changes across the night, and they're plotting that within the dynamic of sleep architecture. So you can actually look at what heart rate variability was doing during, N3, or what we consider deep sleep, what's happening during REM, which REM's a little bit more debatable on like the accuracy. But then we're also like light sleep, and then also between waking transitions. And so I think that ability to plot that over time is really helpful, and it's informative, especially if you do something about it. Again, like I'm kind of sound like a broken record talking about like closing the loop, but I'm just a huge advocate of like I hate people using data if they're not doing anything with it. Like if you're just using it and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy and you're like, oh, look at me, I slept like shit, like I didn't recover well, like I get the day off and I can sit on the couch and eat chips and, drink beer. It's like, okay, well, this is like 100% worked against your favor here. So I'm like really against that.
Okay. So let's pause on the devices and dig into this for a minute. So let's say somebody wakes up and they see a reading like that. What should they do instead of what you just gave as an example?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I think so many people want to say, oh, I've got that singular reading, I'm in the whatever red zone, or like my recovery is like below 60 or 50 or whatever it may be. And for so many people, that they feel like that gives them the automatic out to change behavior. Well, look, I didn't sleep well, I didn't recover well, I should therefore like skip the gym, or I should like I can have like a little bit more like relaxation time. And I would say that like there may be some truth in that, to the extent of you may need to modify some things potentially. I'll talk about that here in a second. But for the most part, again, you're looking at one night's worth of reading, one singular reading. That's not giving us enough longitudinal data to suggest a trend. And this is where I think a lot of people miss the mark when it comes to HRV. And then honestly, data in general, when they're looking at their consumer wearable, is they'll take that one night and then kind of think, oh, I need to make all of these changes, typically for the worst, because of this one night. Or like they feel like crap because their data says that they should feel like crap. And again, this is like this perpetuating self-fulfilling prophecy cycle. And so for me, it's like, follow the trends. If we see one day of like suppressed heart rate variability, one day of like elevated heart rate, one day of really poor sleep, I'm probably not going to do that much different that day, honestly. But if I start to see 2, 3, 4, 5 days a week of downward trends, that's evidence that your nervous system is having a hard time adapting. Because if we see a trend over a week or so of your HRV going in a downward direction, there's a high likelihood that you're overreaching, you're overtraining, or like with many of the athletes that I see, they could be in a really stressful period of time. It may not even necessarily mean that they need to adapt behavior just yet, but it should certainly be a red flag. So I think that for most people listening to this, it would just be knowing, number one, you don't have to make significant changes just based on one day of behavior. You may need to make some adaptations if it's across a period of time, if we're seeing like 3 or 4 days of a downward trend. Yeah.
So, one of the things that, as you're talking through that, like, let's say like, okay, you've got one day and it wasn't scheduled to be an off day. And like you said, you're going to do what you normally would have done. I think you and I and others, it's not like we're the only two in the world, but we may go forward with that day as planned, and then you wake up on the subsequent day and you would almost expect that trend to continue downward. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if it does, you don't get alarmed and you don't automatically jump to, okay, well, now we have 2 days of a downward trend, because you know it was already slightly depressed from where you expected it on the previous day. You went ahead and you did the thing. And now on subsequent day, this is your day off. Like, you know where I'm going with this. And so I guess my question to you is, how are you educating and coaching others to, like, maybe you would just explain this as like, or some people might phrase it as like the difference between like the art and the science of coaching or data analysis. Like with somebody that doesn't want to nerd out on the data, and they just want to know, like, what should I do? How do you help people understand what to do, when to do it, and when to freak out, when not to, or I guess maybe the other missing element here is, like, as you pointed out in sort of your initial answer, was working in behaviors and known stressors and environmental things.
The key element here, I'm going to use kind of a scenario that I use with a lot of people, and I would say, if you did not have your objective data, how would you know that you were recovered? What would you do? And most people would say, I would just like check in subjectively. Like, am I feeling sore? Like, do I feel like I am winded? Do I feel like lethargic or tired? And I'm like, okay, good. You're checking into all these physiological markers and being interoceptive to feel out your body. And you're just kind of going based on like a gut intuition of your own subjective appraisal. And that is one of the biggest things that gets missed nowadays because of wearable data. People take the data as fact and they're not subjectively checking in. So for me, like every single morning, Ryan, I have an anchoring behavior. And what that means is that I'll get up out of bed. I'll go downstairs to my couch where I'm doing a lot of journaling. I'll do breathing. I'll do some meditation. It's kind of where I start my day right before I go to gym. And I'm one of the early morning awakening guys. I'm up at 5 a.m. I've got my whole process. And before I look at any data, like not a shred of data, I do a check-in. I mean, it doesn't take long. I mean, this can take 15 to 30 seconds of just kind of checking in. And almost always, like, that is going to be more of the primary marker for me than anything else. So I just I wanted to share that because I always go back to, like, if you didn't have these wearables, like, what would you do and how would you modify behavior? And for most people, it's like they can connect with that piece, like what life was like prior to wearable data. But then the next component would be is that when you do check data, and again, comparing it to your subjective experience, like, even if you're having those like big suppressions in heart rate variability, you know that there's a downward trend. Like, you know that like there's kind of like this expectation that you're going to see, like, the dark side of the data. Like, when you look at it, is that like it is never going to hurt you and is always going to help you if you just simply prioritize recovery that day. And maybe like we should always be prioritizing recovery. And I'm going to open that up and explain what I mean. Recovery doesn't mean rest day, like don't do anything. Like, prioritizing recovery means, how can I love my nervous system a little bit more today? How can I include a little bit more practices, like something like biofeedback? Maybe for some people, it's like more doing like, hot heat immersion in a sauna, or doing more of some like hot tub therapy or even cold therapy, or whatever it may be for that person. It's just like prioritizing it a little bit more. We should always be prioritizing, like, let's say, recovery to the extent of like doing some practices for downregulating the nervous system, but maybe we just do a little bit we do an extra session that day. Maybe we add in another session of mindfulness or meditation. Like, those are things that I think can be like just really easy, like low hanging fruit for people. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have to change their workout schedule or their dietary schedule or whatever it may be, but they can just add a little bit more priority on downregulating and training their nervous system. And like that solves and fixes so many people's problems. And again, when they're working with me, I'm working on strategically planning that for them and then giving them kind of that more direct advice, like, okay, at this time, I want you to prioritize this. Like tonight, what we're going to really focus on is kind of really separating or situating a great wind down or pre-sleep routine so that we can prioritize sleep as the rest and recovery metric. You got to do that anyway, but let's give yourself maybe a little bit more of a sleep window tonight. Let's shift kind of like the cognitive framework around sleep tonight. So it's those things as opposed to just saying, okay, we're just going to fully like upend like our training schedule. Because it's like, again, if I'm working with a pro athlete and they have, a couple days of suppressed HRV, what am I going to do? Say, yeah, today don't do team practice. Like, yeah, bullshit. They're going to be like, yeah, hell no. Like, I'm not doing that. And their coach is going to come to me and I'm going to get an earful from them. So for me, it's like, no, let's just prioritize other aspects of recovery and rest when we can, but not let that kind of be a replacement for hard work.
Yeah. So as you're talking through the objective data and subjective feels, I'm just like, dude, we're so aligned on so much of this stuff because I personally don't monitor my HRV, at least right now. So when I first got into all of this years ago, I did. But what I did, and I do this with all data, is I do it long enough to be able to, exactly as you said, I want to be able to match my subjective feels with the objective data and then move away from the tool. And now I know, like, I can actually assign metrics or semi-quantifiable things to the subjective feels.
Yes.
One of the biggest reasons that I started doing that, one, I come from sort of like bodybuilding world where everything is like weighed and measured, and I've seen sort of the detrimental effects of like being a slave to numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also, and I'm curious your thoughts on this part of it. The thing that drives me bonkers with athletes is the first thing they do, normal people too, but especially with athletes, because there's a little bit more consequence. They get up, they check that data, and that sets the tone. Like you said, it's sort of a self-perpetuating narrative where, or I'll call it the placebo effect. And it's like, I'm going to have a shitty day because it says I'm not recovered or I got shitty sleep. I can't tell you how many athletes I've had on game day or race day, and they look at that number first thing in the morning and they're texting me or calling me and they're freaking out. I'm like, dude, I told you not to look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Good luck locking in, like when you look and see that all your recovery metrics are in the red, like, because now you're trying to override something cognitively, like in the brain, when you've seen that your physiology is responding one way. And like, it just feels like almost an impossibility.
Right. Like, can you imagine if Michael Jordan on the day of the flu game had done that?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. No, he said, fuck this. I'm overriding everything and I'm going in, and he's still locked in, and rest is history. Right. So it's one of those things where it's like, we know that we can leverage objective data for positivity and recovery, and it can aid, like technology can help, but using it as like the sole source of truth is where people get themselves into far too much trouble.
Yeah. Well said. And I think you've answered this, but just to clarify, like, I know as soon as I say that about, Jordan, and we're talking through this, I know that there's going to be somebody that takes that and says, okay, well, Ryan and Dr. J said, fuck your feelings. It's a Wednesday and I shouldn't be working out, but I'm going to go do it anyway. Like, again, this kind of comes back to the art and science of this. It's like, when should somebody not do the planned workout?
Yeah, this is good. Yeah, this is really good. So this is a bit nuanced, right? Because I wish there was some kind of like special code where I can say, hey, if you see said percentage of change over said number of days, then we should, reduce your, whatever workout by said percentage. And I think that I wish there was that code out there, and maybe one day there is.
There used to be. Do you remember, are you familiar with the dynamometers, the grip strength?
Oh, yeah.
Prior to all of this, that's how strength coaches did it. You either used a grip strength test or a broad jump test, and you had a baseline for all your athletes. And if on a given day they came in and they were 5 or 10, if it was more than 10% below your baseline, it was like a yellow day. And if it was more than 15 or 20% below, it was a red day. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's probably ways to combine metrics to kind of help better understand kind of like the whole milieu of what's happening within your physiology. Like, here's the thing. The evidence is very clear that a suppressed heart rate variability over the course of a period of time, typically looking at around a week's time, when there is a suppressed heart rate variability, it lends itself to a significantly higher propensity towards injury. And that is the biggest thing that I'm looking at, especially working with athletes on helping to prevent, is injury, because injury means, wins, and injury means money, and all sorts of other things for these guys. But for them, it's like, we want to make sure that we set them up for the highest level of recovery so that we can avoid them being injured. So you can think about like something like the NHL season, right? It's grueling. I mean, a grueling season where these guys are just getting the ever living shit beat out of them on a nightly basis. But when you look at the NHL's kind of like history and data related to injury, it's actually a fairly low injury sport. Now, granted, there are a lot of these guys who are just like, I don't care. I've got a broken leg. Like I got a broken femur. I'll still get out there and do it. So it's probably a little bit skewed, but these guys like still like go out there and just continue to perform night after night after night, just getting like killed like every night and having their heart rate up at like 170 for basically like the entire like game. It's an insane sport. But like my point here is that like these guys, like we want them to help better prevent injury. So like in working with these athletes, like these NHL players and NHL teams that I work with, like these guys were assessing their data and then helping to say, okay, we may need to do some adjustments to the intensity of training, not elimination of training, but the intensity of training. And we know that they cannot train every single day at the highest level of intensity and then think that we're going to repair, even though many of them want to do that. So then it's saying, okay, so the times that you're not training, how do we prioritize recovery? What do we do in order to kind of maintain kind of high levels of energy, but reduce that nervous system fluctuation that's typically a lot more of like that sympathetic fight or flight stage that they can be in? How do we help them downregulate? So an easy thing for them is saying, okay, let's go train and do a normal training, but right after the workout, immediately after the workout, let's do 10 to 15 minutes of down regulation. And maybe that's kind of combined with some other therapies. So like a lot of the NHL guys, like what I'll have them do is they'll immediately get off the ice and they'll go like put on like Normatec boots, so like compression boots. And then, they're obviously fueling up on water. Some of them will go straight into a cold bath, but most of them, what I have them doing is kind of combined with those other therapeutics. They're doing, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes of down-regulated breathing and biofeedback. And we're utilizing data to kind of watch their nervous system. And then after that, maybe kind of like right prior to bed, we're having them do another session. So those are things that may be fitting kind of in within their normal window. But if we see that HRV suppression and we say, okay, we want to reduce the propensity towards injury, what can we do reparative to the nervous system? That's where we might tweak some other things. We may say, okay, today we need to add in a strategic nap. Like we really want to give like full restoration and recovery to your nervous system. Let's throw a nap in there. Okay, maybe today, because we see the data kind of really going on a downward trend, like let's start the day with kind of more of a focused, like mental attunement visualization session combined with some biofeedback. So it's really kind of more additive most of the time for these high level athletes, as opposed to like pulling or being subtractive away from what they're normally doing. Now, the everyday individual, there may be kind of like something similar to that, but it may also just be like, hey, listen, you're not a pro athlete. That's okay. We're not all pro athletes, myself included, even though I'd like to think of myself as a pro athlete sometimes, working with them all the time. But I know that I'm not an elite pro athlete, but I care about health and wellness. I'm very active. I'm always doing things. Like, what can I do that's a little bit different in terms of intensity? So maybe it's like, okay, I had scheduled today like a high intensity, like zone 5 level of training. Maybe I cut that duration of training down. Or maybe, hey, let's watch my nervous system tomorrow and see what happens. And if things are kind of looking more stable, then I'll do that zone 5 tomorrow. I'll do zone 2 today. Like if today's a 45-minute bike ride or whatever it may be. And I think that also brings me up to one more point, is that one of the bigger metrics that goes missed, and it is mind-boggling to me why this is not in every single wearable, is an HRV metric called HRV-CV. It's the coefficient of variation of HRV, which most people like don't know about, and that sounds like a mouthful, but it's a very simple metric to understand. It's just looking at stability of HRV over time. So it's saying, like, is HRV kind of holding together? So like, one day it's 55, the next day it's 57, the next day it's 60, the next day it's 55, the next day it's 57. It's kind of holding there together. So that HRV-CV number is going to be lower. So the percentage of variability across days is going to be lower. I mean, it's, let's say, sub 10%. But if we see someone's HRV going from 20 down to 10, up to 50, down to 20, down to 10, now we're seeing HRV-CV widen. And that is when people have a nervous system that is showing signs of a lack of stability. And that's when we need to come in and really focus on prioritizing recovery and potentially modify someone's workout. Because, the more you overtrain, the more you overreach, like your nervous system is breaking down. So therefore, your central nervous system, your brain and your spinal cord, it's not able to react and send signals to your, let's say, muscles as quickly as it should. And so therefore, when you need to provide significant muscular tension, let's say you're on a shift, you're playing tennis and you need to be agile from side to side. If that's not firing as quickly, well, there we go. We may kind of use improper biomechanics. And the next thing we know, there goes your ACL, there goes your MCL. Now, obviously, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but they're all tied together.
Right. I love this, Jay. I want to talk about a couple of specifics on loving your nervous system, to use your term. I might have to borrow that. I will give you credit, though. So you mentioned like with the NHL guys on a day where you're trying to maybe lower intensity, you come off the practice and you get into Normatech, you do some biofeedback, you're doing some breathing. For the average person who maybe doesn't have Normatech device, maybe doesn't have access to biofeedback, they definitely and always have access to breathing. So can you maybe walk us through or teach us some of the specific downregulation breathing techniques?
Yeah. The beauty of that is that it's quite simple. Like, and it's there, that's naturally, like, we've just been built with this as a mechanism to downregulate. And so I don't want people to over-index on thinking like, hey, I need to get the latest and greatest, like, new technologies and like all these things. Like, they're good. They're helpful. I think more than anything, they're probably more helpful in helping to create behavioral habits because they gamify stuff. And so I think like it's just the stickiness that I think is the biggest thing. I don't think that there's any magic in the biofeedback itself, because what biofeedback is just numbers. Like, it's just data that is a mirror of what is occurring in your physiology at any given time. So therefore, like, it's helpful as like giving you that feedback so that it's like, I always tell people it takes like a practice, like let's say meditation or specifically like slow paced breathing. And it takes it from like, oh, I think this is having an impact, subjectively good, to like, okay, I see the quantitative and objective impact. And that makes a behavior more sticky. It makes it become more real. So then therefore you're likely to come back to it more. That to me is the biggest selling point or power on on leveraging technology. But if you don't have that, you don't have any of that stuff, you have innately built into you the ability to change and modify your breathing. Breathing is a direct signal to your nervous system to calm down when it's done properly. And the thing about properly is that it's not that difficult. I'll walk you through it right now. So for most people, we know that you can lower your breathing to around 6 breaths per minute. And that in and of itself can help to activate the vagus nerve, which is again responsible for helping the nervous system to regulate things like your baroreflex mechanism, which is your body's homeostatic blood pressure mechanism, but also like it is a way just to kind of calm down the brain because it sends that bottom up signaling to the central nervous system that you are indeed safe and you're protected, which is kind of really what we need to be telling our nervous system when we're not like being attacked. Now, I don't want my NHL players to feel safe and protected when they're out there like on the ice. No, they need high alert, sympathetic arousal, get the cortisol going, because if you don't, like, you're going to get decked onto the ice and your teeth are coming out. So it's like, you like, I don't need you that. But in between shifts, there we go. We can start to integrate those tools and those techniques. When you're at home recovering, we can integrate those tools and techniques. So what can someone do to get themselves down to 6 breaths per minute, like I mentioned before? Now, what we can unpack in a different conversation, or maybe if we have time to do this one, is that you can actually figure out your personalized breathing pattern for optimizing HRV. This is the literature coming out of Rutgers University for Dr. Paul Lair and his colleagues, looking at what's called resonance breathing or resonance frequency breathing. But again, that requires technology. So if we have no technology and we want to breathe at 6 breaths per minute, it's a simple count. You can do what's called an even breath, which is breathing in and inhaling evenly time wise with your exhale. And it's just simple math. 6 breaths per minute would be a 10-second total cycle, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. A lot of people ask me, should I be doing it through my nose, through my mouth, inhale through the nose, exhale through the nose, or the mouth, whichever is your preference. I typically go for inhale through the nose, exhale through the nose. If you want to breathe out through your mouth, I typically like pursed lips. So kind of like you're blowing through a straw, and that just kind of slows your breathing down so that you're not blowing everything out all at once. So that's it. Or you can do what's called extended exhalation breath, which is a 4-second inhale, 6-second exhale. That's typically my preference for whatever reason. I like the feeling of the extended exhale, even though contrary to popular belief, there's no definitive evidence that the extended exhale like affects nervous system functioning more significantly than an even breath. I tell people it comes down to preference. If you want to do a 5-5, go for it. 4-6, go for it. It's your preference. The only kind of like small piece that I would add into that would just be focusing on your biomechanics. So we as human beings, we naturally, if you watch a baby breathe, we naturally breathe diaphragmatically. Like I would just like employ everybody to go out there and watch, if you have access to a baby, watch how a baby breathes. Their stomach will come out and it looks like they just got done eating at Golden Corral. Like it's like huge, like their belly comes way out when they inhale. And as they exhale, it comes back down to a nice flat surface. The reason that we change that breathing pattern kind of as we age is one, structurally, but more importantly, it's actually because we start to develop really poor breathing habits that's predominantly due to stress. So we start to breathe what's called more thoracically, which is from the chest. But if you think about this from an anatomical position, when you try to inhale and expand your lungs, and your lungs are really large. I mean, it runs from basically like your pecs down to like your stomach, like in that area. Your lungs are a really large organ. If you're only breathing from the chest, you're not able to kind of fill enough capacity of oxygen into the lungs in order to have a significant effect. And actually, if you think about vagal innervations, and that's just a fancy way of saying where does the vagus nerve connect to the lungs, it's at the bottom part of the lungs predominantly. That's where the most innervations occur. So we can actually stimulate the vagus nerve by using better biomechanics, which is a deep diaphragmatic breath. Just like the baby, the stomach goes outward upon inhalation and inward upon exhalation. And that can help to increase the capacity of oxygenation, but also increase that vagal stimulation more heavily. So again, that's a simple way for set your timer on your watch or on your phone for 5 minutes and just do simple 6 breaths per minute breathing using good biomechanics. And I promise you that even if it's not the first time, over time, you're going to see this as a way to help downregulate. Like you're just going to feel it. You're going to be like, okay, this is a stark contrast between when I normally breathe, which most humans breathe around 14 to 16 breaths per minute. It's a big difference and you're going to feel it.
So I'm a huge fan of James Nestor's book, Breath, and I've actually taken Patrick McEwen's Oxygen Advantage, the masterclass, and done the instructor stuff. Both of those guys teach very similar concept. And I think in Oxygen Advantage or the Buteco breathing, it's commonly called like the default breath. And that's how Patrick teaches it, is a 4-second inhale, 6-second exhale. And in Nestor's book, I think he says 5.5, but it's even. I guess my question is, I mean, all of that is stuff that's been published, 3 to 7 years ago. With this new research and the resonance frequency breathing, how is that different, or is there anything different about it?
Yeah, resonance breathing really just comes down to finding the optimal pace of breathing and then just making that change of pace. So what we know is that there are characteristics of your autonomic nervous system that will resonate, which is why it's called resonance frequency. And frequency just means the frequency and cadence of breathing. So there are characteristics of your nervous system that will resonate based on kind of your fixed characteristics, I should say. And a better way to kind of explain this is that we can run a test called the resonance frequency assessment, where we take people through a series of trials and they breathe at different paces. And what they're doing during that time is that we're just kind of lowering the pace of breathing. So it starts at 6.5 breaths per minute, goes all the way down to 4.5 breaths per minute. And we just do 2-minute trials. During that time, we're looking at more advanced analytics of heart rate variability. And we're looking to see what does the cadence and timing of breathing do to their nervous system, and which one is resonating with their nervous system at the highest capacity? So we may say, okay, someone at 6.5 breaths per minute, like their heart rate variability maxed out at 60 milliseconds. And then when we got them down to 5 breaths per minute and they did that cadence, like they were maxing out at 120, and their peak to trough ratio, which is the difference between your heart rate amongst the breath cycle, went from the 6.5 breaths per minute, trial, we'll say it was at 15 as the amplitude. But then when they did 5, like the amplitude was 30. It was double that. So what that means is that their nervous system has a response rate, which is actually very much associated with the dynamic of what's called your baroreflex mechanisms. It's your body's mechanism for maintaining blood pressure homeostasis. We know that it cycles in a frequency that when we match breathing with that frequency and we get those two congruent with one another, like that sets off a cascade of positive relaxation benefits that again are predominantly mediated by your nerves. So when someone's, let's say, resonance frequency rate is 5 breaths per minute, that means we have them breathe at 5 breaths per minute. So that cadence, and that is because the cycling of their baroreflex mechanism operates at 5 breaths per minute or 5 cycles per minute. So that's kind of what we're doing there. So it's a much more like nuanced way of optimizing their vagal output. So I would say that like you go from like step 1, which is like everybody would benefit from like just breathing for a few minutes at 6 breaths per minute, to, well, now let's hone in and find how we can optimize that output. That's what resonance frequency is.
Got it. Okay. That's fascinating. What, I guess earlier you mentioned heat therapy, whether that's sauna or ice bath. Can you talk a little bit about how those can be used or should be used specifically to increase recovery, increase HRV? Because I think those are two that are very commonly misused, again, because I think folks tend to overlook the fact that those are sources of stress in and of themselves, and
oh, yeah.
Be careful with that exposure and use it properly.
Yes, man, it's been so overdone, right? It's like, the podcasts have perpetuated like ice baths are great, saunas are great. And so I think people are like, okay, so the more the better, right? Like, let's just keep doing this thing over and over and over again without kind of checking in. You hit the nail on the head that these are inherently stressful practices. Like go get in a sauna and stay in there for 20 minutes and check where your heart rate is and where your HRV is. It's going to be tanked. Like, it's not going to look good. And so therefore you would think, oh gosh, like, is this actually good for me? Well, think about kind of the what it's a mimetic of. It's kind of like similar to like exercise, right? In that it's not the same. And let me make sure I'm very clear that exercise and sauna are not the same. Now they're both kind of head down a similar path, but it's not like you can replace exercise by just doing sauna every day. Not going to be effective for that matter. But what it is that it's exposing yourself to a stressor to help build your nervous system back. That's one way that it's helping in a much more stronger capacity. So it's a way of like nervous system resiliency training. And one of the things I actually have a lot of my athletes do, because I think it's a good mental challenge and it's a good way to help create better nervous system control, is I'll have them go into a sauna and actually do some biofeedback within the sauna session to see how well they can control their nervous system in a very like intense but controlled environment. And it's a challenge. Like if you try to go in there and regulate your heart rate in a, like, especially if your sauna's hot, like I've got a Swedish sauna, so that puppy gets up to, over 200 degrees and it's humid. It's rough. Like it's very hard to move the needle, but I love that as a challenge because I'm like, well, that's challenge under pressure, right? So like if you're out on the ice or you're like, you're up to bat or about to be up to bat in a huge MLB situation, like that's good training ground for what you would experience there. So I have them do that. And like the cold plunge is the same thing. It makes it a little bit harder to like track data in a cold plunge because like your periphery gets really cold. So like actually getting good blood flow to look at data can be a little bit challenging. But I think it's more than anything, it's a good mental test. So like athletes have used cold plunges and, saunas forever. And a lot of them are using it more for the muscular recovery. Now, most like, everyday individuals, like weekend warriors, probably aren't going to find as much of like the benefit on the the recovery side like an athlete would from those things. So I think like the cold plunge especially is probably the best. It's probably better used as like a mental training ground more than anything, and like getting kind of like that dopamine release. But again, like I don't want to overspeak here because I wouldn't say that that's as much of my domain as like some of the other areas. But what I would say is that if you are using those things and you have said like, hey, I've looked at the evidence and I think that, you know, it makes sense for me to be doing sauna, to be doing cold plunge, like there are mechanisms for making sure that you're not overdoing it. And the main thing that you could be doing is like tracking your HRV overnight or in the morning on a consistent basis. And then again, it's one of those behaviors that you can take and begin to correlate it with it. So like, I'll give you a for instance here, Ryan. Like I had a professional athlete of mine, huge in the health and wellness space, listens to podcasts all the time, is trying to digest everything he can for high performance just to give him that little bit of physical and mental edge. And he was kind of like I take everything as like you do it more, it's better for you. So like he was literally, I kid you not, doing cold plunges 7 days a week, twice a day, 14 cold plunges a day. And the dude was like, man, my nervous system is wrecked. Like I feel like, you know, sluggish. I'm like, I wonder why, dumbass. It's like, look at what you've been doing. But like, it took him, like, he kept convincing himself, oh, just keep doing this, like more the better. And it took him seeing how his data were tanking over time for him to say, okay, you're right. I'm going to pull the plug on this. I'm not going to like eliminate cold plunging, but I'm certainly not going to do it 7 days a week. And I'm certainly not going to do it 14 times a week, twice a day. So then he could leverage that to begin to correlate. Okay, like if I do cold plunges like 3 times a week, I actually see that my nervous system is adapting, repairing. I'm feeling better. Like I'm getting better muscular recovery. And I'm like, okay, now we've kind of hit the Goldilocks spot here, because that's what it is, right? It's trying to find the Goldilocks spot of like not too much, not too little. Like what's the right thing that we can be doing, especially for nervous system repair. Just like leverage the data for that.
All right. We branched way off of the main branch of the tree here. I want to bring you back to devices, because we touched, yes, I think a little bit, maybe you covered Aura as one of the devices. You want to talk about any of the other ones?
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought us back to this, because I was thinking about that in the back of my mind. I was like, I wonder how we can weed this back in. So thanks to just kind of like for full stop and coming back to it. That's right. So, okay. What I was kind of first doing was talking about like the overnight recovery wearables. So Aura is good. Well, the one thing that I'm not going to do is badmouth any type of wearable directly, but I am going to badmouth some wearables right now that do this. I would say that if a wearable that you're using is not tracking HRV on a continuous or semi-continuous basis overnight, and is just looking at like, let's say, their own proprietary way of calculating and collecting HRV, run for the hills. And so many people who have heard me on other podcasts, I've kind of mentioned maybe here and there some wearables that do that, like just for the sake of making sure that I don't get sued. I want to just kind of like say that there are wearables that follow their own science. And let's say they kind of are carving their own path to be proprietary and different from everyone. Those are the ones that just aren't validated. I know Aura doesn't do that, so I can suggest Aura as a great way. I know that Garmin is another one that is phenomenal with their HRV tracking. So I recommend Garmin like all the time. I would say that like simply because Apple Watch does not have any type of consistent practice of collecting HRV and analyzing HRV, like it's one that I'll directly tell people, like, you're not going to get any value from the data. Like it's not set up in a way that gives you anything that's usable. So those are like the wearables. I mean, there's other wearables out there, but I know that those are kind of like the primary ones that people are using. The ones that I would say that for tracking, but also training, so more on the biofeedback side, this is where I think that there's a lot of great solutions. But actually, before I get into biofeedback, let's go more like baseline testing. My friend, who is like a world-class data scientist, an HRV expert, Dr. Marco Altini out of Italy, he created a free app for HRV training. It is not overnight. It is one that you consistently check in the morning, and you just use your phone, and actually you use the camera to detect pulse rate. And the thing is, it's been validated in numerous studies to be immensely accurate. His company is called HRV, the number 4 training. So HRV for training. It is a wonderful free app for tracking baseline heart rate variability over time. And I would recommend that app like over just about anything. Elite HRV is another great free one. It requires a wearable, but I like HRV. The data analytics and the UI UX of their app is really good. But if you're going to go for free and accurate, Marco Altini. So those are the two that I go more for, like morning checks, which do have benefit, by the way. And I'll hit on that just really quickly. The overnight one gives you great information, and it's very passive, and it's easy for people because they put a ring on or they put a wrist strap on and they just go to bed. But what I think I'm more convinced of now more than ever is that consistent morning readings probably provide us with the most valuable information regarding baseline. And here's why. When you're looking at sleep, you're expecting the nervous system to be in at least a state of reparation and recovery. That is why we sleep, right? It is a mechanism for recovery and repair for the body and the mind. However, when we wake up in the morning, we can assess the impact and the effects of sleep on the nervous system because now we've gotten our full rest. So how well did we rest and recover? That's where the morning reading comes in. But also, and this is a big piece for me as a psychologist, we pull in the psychological components. And what I mean by that is that when you're sleeping, yeah, you're dreaming and the mind will be processing, but you're not you're not cognitively aware of the thoughts. Whereas when you wake up, your day's about to start, right? What do I have on the list of things to do today? This, and this. And you start to factor in the psychological variables, which I think can be immensely valuable for everybody. So you're kind of bringing in both the physiological repair and recovery with the psychological components, making the consistent morning readings like a really important strategy. So again, that's where HRV or HRV for training and elite HRV can be really helpful. And then to the more training components, like how can we train the nervous system for resiliency, which is biofeedback, which we haven't gotten into today. Maybe that's a topic for another podcast, which I think is kind of like the bread and butter of where HRV shines. That is where like companies like Optimal HRV is really good. So they're, based out of Ina Kazan's work out of Harvard. So very much like deeply embedded into the science. I really love them. But I think that the newest technology I'm most excited about, and this is where I was talking about my financial connections with. So again, make that very clear that I am connected with this company, is a company called OHM, OHM. So you can go to ohm.health and check them out. They're creating a lamp, and this lamp is essentially a biofeedback lamp where you pick up a stone on top. The stone has sensors that you place into your palm. You just hold this nice heavy stone and it starts to begin to map the nervous system. And once it's mapped the nervous system, then the light on the lamp will just move up and down as a breathing pacer. And you just follow it as it goes up. You inhale. As it goes down, you exhale. And you can feel haptics actually in the stone as well. It'll vibrate on the inhale, vibrate down on the exhale. And what I love about this is that it makes biofeedback pretty accessible to people. There's no need for a wearable. Like you just pick up a stone and you start. So it removes that huge behavioral barrier that happens to so many people. And then what's great about it is that it's mapping your resonance frequency without having to go through a trial. It's using an algorithm to look at what is your resonance rate, and the pacer will adjust to your resonance rate. And then once it sees that you're in this deep state of resonance, the orange glow of the lamp will actually go blue and turn colors, indicating that you're in that flow locked in state. So again, that is the one. It's not out yet. You can pre-order it. So there's my pitch for it, but it is going to be like an amazing revolutionary technology for just making biofeedback like a more easy to access and perform therapeutic.
Do you have a special discount code for listeners of the podcast?
I'll have to check with the team to see if I can get one. I think like right now they're just like reserving. It's like $20 and you can reserve it. But I bet I can find a discount code that I can send to you at some point that you can send out to listeners. Yeah.
That sounds amazing. I love that. I mean, to your point about making it accessible, right? Like biofeedback is now accessible. I mean, I remember the first time I did it, I was at Peak Brain in LA. I'm with, a neuroscientist, a guy that's a professor at UCLA, and you've got the full, EEG headgear on, and there's like it's basically like, what was the video game where like the ball bounces back and forth with the paddles and
like Pong. Yeah.
Like that's up on the screen. And like, I mean, it's amazing, but it, like, to your point, it's not very accessible to the average person. So No, I love
Exactly.
the fact that this is going to be accessible. We'll put links to all this stuff in the show notes, make it easy on people to find OM and the HRV for train. I don't want to get you into trouble, but I noticed that you did not mention Whoop. I'm going to get asked. So,
Yeah.
what is the reason you didn't mention it because they're doing their own thing?
Whoop is doing their own thing. What I will give Whoop credit for is that when they do things, they validate studies on their own. So like they do it internally. And to my knowledge, that information is not published. So if I was able to review and look at the data regarding kind of the algorithm use and the efficacy of it compared to like, let's say a standard protocol for HRV measurement, then I would be maybe more apt to defend them. What I will say is that like what people always notice when they see me is they say, why is my Whoop heart rate variability so incredibly higher and different than my Aura? And which is kind of the better of the two? And I would say, I think that Whoop shines in a lot of areas, but I wouldn't say that I give them the highest level of credibility for that metric in and of itself.
Got it. All right. I know you've got a hard stop coming up. So 2 quick questions and then we'll let you get out of here. First one is, where can people get more of your work and follow you?
Yeah, I love it. So, I mean, I'm on Instagram, so at Dr. J Wiles, so you can follow me there. I would say that the best place too to kind of learn a little bit more about my work is to go to my website, which is thrive-wellness.com. So thrive-wellness.com, which is more of like my consulting clinic as well. You know, I also, one of the things that I never even mentioned in this podcast as a part of one of my duties is that I also operate as the director of behavioral medicine for Absolute Rest, which is, if your listeners are familiar with Dr. Andy Galpin. It's his sleep-based company that really works on working with high performers on the sleep side of things. So that's really kind of more specific to people with sleep problems. So for me, kind of within that context, obviously I'm helping people directly with sleep, but we're focusing predominantly on nervous system functioning and management within that context as well. So I would always offer that out to people if they're like really interested in sleep work. Then absoluterest.com is a great place to check out as well.
So many things we can talk to you about. You're gonna have to come back on, and you may be like the first time guest.
Let's do it.
All right. So, final question: what would be your biggest piece of advice for somebody who wants to develop more consistency or move the chains, not just with HRV or nervous system recovery, but just in general?
Yeah. So other than get your head out of your ass, I would say that because I think most people, and when I say that, I think that most people are kind of stuck in their own way and they can't find their way out. And I'm like, if you just pull that out of your butt, like you might actually be okay. But otherwise, like my biggest piece of advice that I always give to people is learn how to get to neutral. Everybody always wants to be driven like into drive or in reverse. And I would say learn how to get to neutral. And what I really mean by that, because that sounds a little bit nebulous, is like learn how to mentally attune to your environment and to your own experience. So many people are stuck in autopilot, man. It's like constant, perpetual, like buying into their own thoughts, buying into their own beliefs, and they get stuck there. And then that means that they get stuck and they can't move forward in anything else. And I would say that when I have worked with the greatest athletes, the greatest high performers in the entire world, is that they know how to get into neutral within the context of their thinking. And that's actually a way that you can help manage your nervous system, is that you can shift your thinking into neutral and not be so stuck in all the past failures and bullshit. And also not just be always looking at the finish line. It's like win every single practice and fundamental, and the championships will come, but you got to learn how to get to neutral.
I love it. Jay, this has been a blast, man. Thanks so much for hanging out with us. We are going to get you back on. For everybody listening, thank you so much for being a part of the Move the Chains podcast. And if you dig what you're hearing here, please share it with your friends, subscribe to the show so you get notifications every time we drop a new episode, and we'll catch you on the next one.